Okay, so welcome back. This is part two in our series where we help you to understand charts in C# Windows Forms applications, how to work with them. And I encourage you to look at part one where we talk about some of the basic concepts behind charts. It can be kind of confusing. The documentation is often very unhelpful. And in this video, we're going to look at the next set of features of charts. You can see we have here a logger application we started a series on recently. Show you how to develop this logger application that logs data in real time and charts it. You can see we've got about a little over 30 minutes worth of data that's coming from an Arduino over the COM port, and we're plotting it in real time. You can maybe see that it's updating here, and we're plotting out the data. And we're going to show you how to do charts like this. We're going to talk about things like major and minor grids. Can get kind of confusing. We're going to talk about scaling the axes. Again, it can get kind of confusing. We're going to talk about how to make a scrolling window of data. For example, I've got it set so when it gets to be 60 minutes of data, it's going to start scrolling and knock off the anything over 60 minutes and just show you the last 60 minutes of data in a real-time scrolling window. We'll show you how to do that. We're also going to show you how to make a simple class that will help you very much to work with charts. Now, if you look at the code you're going to need to generate just to configure your charts, you're going to see a lot of this here where it can get really monotonous and a whole lot of repeats of information just to set up the charts. And we're going to show you how to set up a simple class that you can access. And then once you've got that set up, you can, for example, configure your chart with just one line of code. You just reference this. I've got a line graph class, and I just feed it a bunch of data and it will automatically set up the scaling and a lot of what we need. So if you do a lot of charting, you use some very typical charts, like this is a simple line chart that I use all the time. You can set up a class and just feed it some data and we'll go through and do all of that monotonous work behind the scenes. Okay, so now let's focus on the chart axes and try to understand the terminology associated with them. So I have here a simple line chart. I've marked out some of the different components based on the terminology that Microsoft uses. Here is the vertical axis, which is the y-axis, and of course the horizontal is the x-axis. Then there are the grid lines. You can see these cross-hatched lines. The terminology is for the major grid line is axis y major grid, and you can see it's a solid line here. But I've also enabled what's called the minor grid, which you can show other grid lines between the major grids, but you have to enable them. So this is a axis y minor grid, and I've set it to be dashed. And then there's one other aspect of the axis, and that is what's called the interval. And the interval specifies an interval between the major grid lines. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute, what interval? What is it? Is it a, like in this case, 0.1 to 0.2? How do I specify the interval? Is it like 0.1 because there's an interval of 0.1 between the two? Or is there something else I specify? Is it a percentage? Or so if you are confused, then all you have to do is go to the Microsoft documentation and they will explain to you what this means and what are the units and everything else. And if you go to the axis.interval property, you can scroll down here and it clearly explains it's a double value that represents the interval of an axis. So the interval is the interval, right? There's nothing to say. You can default it to auto, which means you set it to a value of 0. Unfortunately, what they don't tell you is, well, how does that affect the minor grids? And do I use this to specify minor grids? And really, it's very confusing. So we're going to go into this in a little bit of detail to show you how you can set up these axes. Now, there are other elements to the axes besides the grid lines and the interval, and they're listed down here. You can see we've got axis labels, which are these labels. I've specified the minimum and maximum, and it adds labels to each grid line. And of course, we talked about the major and minor grid lines we talked about. You can also specify tick marks. I don't have them here, but in between the major grids, you can have little tick marks to show where the sub numbers are between the major grids. And you can also specify minor grids with those tick marks. And you can also specify what are called strip lines. Now, I don't have strip lines here. I believe they are basically just a rectangular area to highlight part of your chart. You can play with those if you want. But those are the basic elements of the axis. Okay, so now let's open a blank C# Windows Forms application, which you can see here. And we're going to start to look at the basics of how the charts are laid out and how we can configure a chart for our needs. So I've got a blank form. I'm going to go into the toolbox, and I can either search for chart or I can scroll down to the data. And you can see I've got a chart here. Click, left click, drag and drop. And here I've got my basic chart. Now, as we said in the first video, the terminology is that this box here that I just dragged is a chart. Inside it, it's got a chart area, and inside that, it's got one or more chart series. So if you look over here at the properties, if I select the chart, it's chart 1, and it's got series, and it's got chart areas. Let's go to the areas, chart areas. We explained in the previous video, and it's a collection of chart areas, and by default, it gives you chart area 1, and it will also give you series 1 inside that chart area. So we know that if we're going to start to build a chart, we've already got a pre-configured chart area 1 and series 1 that we can start to use. We can add to that. You go down here to add, and the same thing with the series, but there's already one set up for us to use. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click on this and hit F7, and it brings us to the Windows Forms application where we can start entering our data. So now let's start this up and see what we get with the default chart area and default series. So I press the start button. You can see we get a blank chart. There's no data. It already has series 1 available for us. We can just start filling in data, but it has nothing here. So we're going to have to start giving it some data and see what it does. So we said in the previous video that we have a series which specifies the data that we're going to chart. So here we've got series 1, which is the default. And what we want to do is we want to add points. So we can access the points and use add XY and then specify the points. So let's say we want 0, 10 for our first point in our chart. So now that we've got that, let's start and see what we get. Aha, now it automatically has taken that value of 10 and it's given us this 1 point. It's giving us a bar chart and it has shown us a value of 10 for the first point. Now you can see we specified 0, but it puts it at 1. And it gives us an automatic maximum of 12. And it goes from 0 to 2 in the x-axis. So let's say we don't like this. So now we're going to learn about how to set up the axes, the minimum and the maximum, the grid lines, and to make it look more like what we want. So now let's say we want a line chart instead of a bar chart. Well, we know that the chart type for each specific chart we're going to do is associated with the series, right? So you can have different chart types for each series. We've only got one series, so what we're going to do is we're going to enter the series chart type, and we're going to call it series chart type.line. Now, we get a squiggly here because we don't have a using statement for the charting. So we can do using System Windows Forms Data Visualization charting, and we can add that, and now it will be happy with our line chart. So now that we've specified we want a line chart, let's start it again and see what we get. Now we have a chart, but it doesn't show any data. But actually, there is a point on this chart for this first point we added. So to prove that, let's add another point. I'll do a Control D to duplicate, and I'll go to 1 and 20 and rerun it and see what we get. Okay, so now we have, it started out at 0 and it's giving us an automatic scaling on the x-axis of -1 to 2. It just decided to do that. So we've got our point 0, 10 and 1, 20, and it's automatically scaled up to 25. So now we want to personalize and customize this so it's the way we want. So let's say we don't want to start at 0, and let's say we want to have fixed maximum and minimums on these axes, and maybe we want to add some minor grid lines. So let's see how we can customize this to make it the way we want using the Microsoft terminology. So now let's say I want to specify the minimum and maximum on the x-axis. How do I do that? Well, before we add these points to the chart, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to copy and paste some code, and I'm going to set the minimum as 0 instead of -1, and the maximum is going to be, let's say, 5. All right, so now I've specified I want it to go from 0 to 5. Let's run that. And you can see it started out at 0 and goes to 5. So now let's say I want to do the same thing for the y-axis. Well, I can Control D and then Control D and then click Alt and then drag and change this to Y. And now I can set the y-axis maximum minimum. And let's say I want to go from minimum to 10 and maximum to 20. Now I can run that. And now we've specified from 10 to 20 and from 0 to 5. Now again, you're probably going to want to think about doing this with your charts. Now we also want to get rid of this legend. So to get rid of the legend, we can just enter this chart1 legends.clear. And we can start that up, and you can see it got rid of the legends. So now let's say we're not happy with the thickness of this line. We want something a little bit thicker. Well, how do you do that? Well, as we mentioned in another video, unfortunately, the terminology here is not very good. What they use is called the border width. So you access the series 1, border width, and that is an integer starting at 1. So we can say 3 is the border width, which means we're going to get a thick line. So we'll start again. And you can see now we have a width of 3. Again, very unfortunate terminology, but that's the way Microsoft is. So now we've got that. What else are we going to want to do? So now let's say, okay, we set the minimum and maximum to 10 and 20. But now we want to have major grid lines instead of every 2 units, maybe every 1 unit. So how are we going to tell Windows Forms to give us every 1 unit between the major grids? Well, we said there is a property called the interval. So what does that mean? Does that mean the interval, if we want it every 1 unit, we tell it 1, or is it in percentage of the difference between the two? Or, you know, what is this interval? So let's take a look at the interval and then see, you know, maybe we want to add some minor grids. How does the interval affect that? So let's go back here and try and figure out what kind of interval we should pick. Well, we know that it is associated with the chart area, the interval, and it's with the axis. So what we're going to do is we're going to paste in this chart 1, chart areas, chart area 1, axis Y interval, and we're going to set that. So let's assume that it's got to be in the same units as the maximum scale. So now we want to have the interval, right before it was an interval of 2, now we want to set it to an interval of 1. Let's see if that works. We'll start it up, and aha, so it worked. So that interval value is in the same units as the minimum, and maximum. So now we know that the interval is in the same units as the scaling of the axis. All right, so we went from 10 to 20, and now we're saying in units of 1. All right, so now let's say instead of having so many major grids, let's say we just want to have an interval of maybe 5, so it'll go 10, 15, and 20, and the others we want to have as minor grids, all right, like little dashed lines or something. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can set this back to an interval of 5 and run that, and there we got 5. So now we want to fill this in with maybe minor grids every unit of 1. So how do we do that? Well, the minor grid is not enabled by default. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to enable the minor grid for the y-axis. So here's the code. Chart area 1, axis y, minor grid enabled equals true. All right, so we've now enabled it, so let's run it and see what it does. Aha, so now it has automatically 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It has automatically put in grids there, but there's no labels associated with them, and they're kind of solid lines, but they are at the interval that we wanted. They're like every 1 unit. Now we can change that, but for now, let's just take a look at changing this grid so it looks more like a minor grid instead of a major grid. So maybe we want it to be like a dashed line or something. So to specify a dashed line, we will put this code, and it is the minor grid line dash style equals chart dash style dot dash, okay? Kind of confusing, and we're going to try to make this a lot easier in a little bit, where we're going to make a class that has all this data behind the scenes, and we just have to specify the settings. But for now, we will show you what the code is for that. We'll run it, and now we can see we've got dashed lines between the major grid lines. We could also change the color of those grid lines to make them less visible. How would we do that? Well, to change the color, we could use a line like this that says minor grid dot line color equals color dot, say, dark gray. And keep in mind we've got the using system drawing so that we can specify this color. So let's say, actually, let's make it a light gray. And we'll run it. And we can see, yeah, you can just barely see the grid lines. Maybe that's okay, maybe not. But you get the point. You can have the grid lines here, and then we can change the interval of the grid lines. Say we want the minor interval every 2 units. How are we going to set the interval of the minor grid? Well, as you can imagine, it's going to look something like axis y minor grid something. So we'll paste it, and it's minor grid dot interval. Now, what is the interval? We've already set the interval for the major grid, so what is the minor grid interval? Well, in fact, it is a function of the major grid interval. So let's say I want to set an interval that is half the major grid interval. We could set major grid interval divided by 2. Right? So what we're saying is, to set the minor grid interval, we'll just take the major grid interval and divide by 2. And we'll run that. Now you might look at this and say, wait a minute, the minor grids are not at an interval of 1/2 of the major grids. They're still at an interval of 1. So it's 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So what's going on here? Well, with the minor grid intervals, it can be very confusing. What you need to do is you need to set it to the axis y interval, not the major grid interval. So if we remove this major grid and just have the axis y interval divided by 2, we'll start it up. And you can see here's the minor grids. Hopefully you can see it on YouTube. But there's one minor grid between each major grid, just as we specified. So be very careful. You got to make sure you're doing the axis Y interval, not the major grid. Okay, well, this video is getting a little bit long, and since nobody watches more than about 4 minutes of tech training videos, I'll wait for the next video. We'll talk about data binding and adding data to charts. And we'll also talk about a moving window of data, so you can set up a window of maybe the last 30 or 60 minutes worth of data that just keeps scrolling. Anyway, if you like any of these videos, I appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe, hit the bell notifications, and most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some more views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.